The Galactic Concord station hung in the darkness of space like a jewel made of light and metal. And Ambassador Yellen Vasquez stood at its heart, waiting for humanity's future to be decided by creatures who thought her species was nothing more than clever animals. She had prepared for this moment her entire life, learning 17 alien languages and studying diplomatic customs that were older than human civilization itself. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the way the council members looked at her, with a mixture of curiosity and pity that made her want to scream. The crystalline HFY counselor, whose name translated roughly as shimmering through glass, spoke first in a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a storm. "We have reviewed your species application for membership in the Galactic Concord," she said, her body refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns across the walls. "And we find humanity to be a young and promising species with much potential for growth under proper guidance." Vasquez kept her expression neutral, even as her heart sank, because she knew what was coming next. The towering insectoid Karmoth representative clicked his mandibles together before speaking through his translator device, and his words confirmed her fears. "The Council offers humanity protected species status," he announced, "which will grant your people access to basic trade routes and educational resources, while more advanced species oversee your development and ensure your safety." Protected species status was a polite way of saying that humanity would become galactic pets, watched over and controlled by elder races who believed they knew better. And Vasquez had not traveled 3 months through hostile space to accept such an insult. She opened her mouth to argue, to present the carefully prepared speech about human achievement and potential. But she never got the chance. The station shuddered violently, and alarms began screaming in a dozen different languages as the lights flickered and died, before emergency power kicked in with a red glow that made everything look like it was bleeding. "Breach in Sector 7. A computerized voice announced calmly. "Hollow swarm vessels detected. All personnel evacuate to designated safe zones immediately." The reaction of the council members told Vasquez everything she needed to know about the hollow swarm, because the HFY counselor's crystal body dimmed with terror while the Karmoth's massive form actually trembled, and the aquatic diluvian representative made a sound like a whale dying as his tank's water churned with fear. "We must evacuate," shimmering through glass said, already moving toward the emergency exits with the others. "The swarm has not attacked the Concord station in centuries. They must be desperate or mad. But either way, we cannot fight them here." Vasquez did not move, because she was watching the 6 humans who served as her security detail, and what she saw on their faces was not Fear Sergeant Major Cole Erickson. Was a man built like a tank with eyes like chips of blue ice. And he was smiling. Not a happy smile, but the smile of a wolf who had just spotted prey. "Ma'am," he said to Vasquez in a voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather, "recommend you shelter in place with the council while my team handles the situation." "Handles the situation?" The Karmoth representative repeated in disbelief. "There are at least 50 swarm warriors breaching this station, and you have 6 soldiers. Your mathematics are as primitive as your species." Erickson did not bother responding to the insult. He simply turned to his team and began issuing orders in quick, clipped phrases that Vasquez barely understood. And then they were moving, not toward the evacuation routes, but toward the breach, toward the enemy, toward certain death, according to every tactical doctrine. The galaxy had developed over 10,000 years. Shimmering through glass, stopped at the chamber door and turned back, her crystalline form pulsing with confusion. "What are they doing?" she asked Vasquez. "Why do they run toward danger instead of away from it?" Vasquez thought about her grandfather, who had stormed beaches under machine gun fire, about her mother who had served 3 tours in places most people could not find on a map, about the long bloody history of a species that had clawed its way to the stars through sheer Stubborn refusal to die. They are doing what humans do, she said simply. They are protecting their people. The security feed showed what happened next, and Vasquez would remember every second of it for the rest of her life. The swarm warriors were nightmares. Made flesh, creatures with too many limbs and mouths, full of razor teeth that could tear through metal like paper, and 50 of them poured through the breach in a wave of chitinous horror that had broken elder species. Armies since before humanity discovered fire. 6 humans met them in the corridor. Ericsson's team moved like a single organism, each member knowing exactly where the others would be without looking, covering angles and creating crossfire zones that turned the narrow hallway into a killing ground. They did not fight like the Concord soldiers fought, with careful formations and measured responses based on centuries of doctrine. They fought like something wild and ancient and utterly without mercy. When the first human took a wound that would have sent a Karmoth warrior into shock, he simply kept firing with his other hand while his teammate applied a bandage without either of them breaking stride when ammunition ran low. They switched to blades and close combat with a ferocity that made the swarm warriors actually hesitate, because these creatures had never encountered prey that did not run, that did not freeze, that looked at death with teeth bared and attacked. Anyway, shimmering through glass watched a human female, half the size of a swarm warrior, wrap her legs around its neck and drive a knife into its brain while 2 of its claws were buried in her shoulder. And the HFY counselor's translator could not find words for what she was witnessing. "This is impossible," she whispered. "They should be dead 10 times over. Why do they not fall?" The answer came from the human ambassador, who watched the carnage with an expression that mixed pride with sorrow. "Because falling means their friends die," Vasquez said. "And that is simply not acceptable to them." The battle lasted 11 minutes, which was 10 minutes longer than any tactical model predicted 6 soldiers could survive against 50 swarm warriors. And when it ended, there were 50 dead aliens and 6 wounded humans who were already joking with each other as they applied field medicine. Erickson limped back to the council chamber with half his face covered in blood that was mostly not his own, and he saluted Ambassador Vasquez with a hand that was missing 2 fingers. "Threat neutralized, ma'am," he reported. "Apologies for the mess." The council members stared at him in silence that stretched for a very long time, and it was the Diluvian representative who finally spoke in a voice that bubbled with something that might have been awe. "What manner of warriors are these?" he asked. "What caste do they belong to? Are these your elite forces? Your genetic champions, your technologically enhanced soldiers?" Erickson looked at the alien with genuine confusion before answering. "Sir, we are just embassy guards," he said. "Regular infantry with basic security training. Nothing special at all." The silence that followed was so deep that Vasquez could hear her own heartbeat, and she watched understanding spread across the council members, faces like dawn breaking over a dark world. If these were humanity's ordinary soldiers, the ones considered nothing special, then what were their elites? What were these creatures that humans called special forces? Shimmering through glass requested a private session with the council immediately, and Vasquez was not invited. But she did not need to be there to know what they were discussing. Humanity would not be receiving protected species status after all, because the galaxy had just learned a very important lesson about the small, fragile, short-lived creatures from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable star. They had learned to be afraid. 6 months after the attack on the Concord station, the galaxy was burning. The hollow swarm had grown bold after centuries of easy victories against species that followed predictable rules of warfare, and they had consumed 3 entire star systems in a wave of hunger and destruction that left nothing behind but empty worlds. And the bones of Billions General Vrexthal of the Karmoth stood in his command center and watched his carefully planned Defensive lines crumble one by one. And for the first time in his 200 years of military service, he felt something he had never experienced before. He felt despair. The Concorde's combined fleets were vast and ancient, and equipped with technology that humans could barely understand. Yet none of it mattered against an enemy that did not fear death, that bred faster than they could be killed, that attacked with no pattern his tactical computers could predict. "General," his aide announced nervously, "the human advisory contingent has arrived." Rexthal made a sound of disgust deep in his thorax, because he had not requested human help and did not want it. But the Concord Council had insisted, after hearing exaggerated stories about some minor skirmish on a space station. He expected the humans to arrive with a massive fleet and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, because that was how real military powers operated. And he was prepared to waste valuable time explaining basic tactics to primitives who had only been spacefaring for a few generations. What he got was a single transport ship carrying 200 soldiers in unmarked black armor. Colonel Diana Okonkwo was a tall woman with skin like polished wood and eyes that reminded Rexthal of a predator he had seen once on a death world. Patient and watchful and utterly without mercy. "Where is the rest of your force?" he demanded, his translator making his clicking speech into flat human words. Okonkwo smiled, and it was not a reassuring expression. "General, you are looking at Operational Detachment Theta," she said. 200 operators from 12 different special operations units, representing the combined elite forces of Earth. "We do not need more." Rexthal wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, because his own forces numbered in the millions and they were losing. Yet these humans thought 200 soldiers would make a difference. He assigned them to a quiet sector and forgot about them, because he had real problems to solve 3 weeks later. The swarm offensive on the Karath front simply stopped. Rexthal stared at the tactical display in confusion, because enemy forces that had been advancing steadily for months were now in full retreat, abandoning positions they had paid millions of lives to capture. What happened? He demanded of his intelligence officer. The answer made no sense at first. "The human operators." "General," the officer said with something like fear in his voice, "they went behind enemy lines and they have been hunting." Hunting was not a word the Karmoth used for military operations, because it implied something primitive and savage that civilized species had evolved beyond. Yet it was the only word that fit what the humans were doing. They deployed in teams of 4, inserting deep into swarm-controlled territory with minimal supplies and no backup. And they stayed there for weeks at a time, doing things that should have been impossible. They learned the swarm's chemical communication language in days and used it to send false signals that turned entire hive clusters against each other. They identified high-ranking swarm commanders and tracked them across hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain, never stopping to rest, never losing the trail, until their targets simply collapsed from exhaustion and were killed in their sleep. They captured enemy soldiers and somehow turned them into informants, using nothing but conversation and an understanding of psychology that no Concord species had ever developed, because no Concord species had ever needed to understand their own minds so deeply. Lieutenant Crucible was one of the few Karmoth officers who worked directly with the human teams, and his report to General Rexthal was delivered in a voice that trembled with something between horror and admiration. "I watched a human operator pursue a swarm pack leader for 9 days straight," he said. "The humans slept in 2-hour shifts while moving, ate whatever local organisms would not kill him immediately, and covered over 400 kilometers of terrain that my own scouts called impassable. When he finally caught the pack leader, he was wounded and out of ammunition, so he killed the creature with his hands while singing." "Singing?" Rexthal repeated in disbelief. "He called it a cadence," Crucible said. a traditional song humans use to maintain rhythm during physical exertion. He strangled a swarm berserker 3 times his mass, while keeping time with a song about marching. The general requested a meeting with Colonel Okonkwo, and when she arrived in his command center, he looked at her with new eyes. "Your soldiers do not fight like any warriors I have ever seen," he said. "They do not follow doctrine or formation or any tactical principles I recognize. They fight like animals." Okonkwo did not seem insulted by the comparison. "General, do you know what humans were before we developed technology?" she asked. "We were persistent predators. Our ancestors did not run faster than their prey or fight stronger than their enemies. They simply followed and followed until their targets dropped dead from exhaustion." She pulled up an image on his display, showing a primitive human with a spear chasing a 4-legged creature across an endless grassland. "This hunt could last for days," she explained. "The prey would sprint away and hide and think it was safe. Then look back and see the human still coming, still walking, never stopping. Eventually, the prey's body would simply give out, and the human would walk up to it and kill it without any fight at all." Rex Thiel felt his spiracles tighten with an instinctive fear he did not understand. "That is how your special forces fight?" he asked. "That is how all humans fight," Okonkwo corrected him. "The special forces are simply the ones who are best at it. They are the ones who can keep going when their bodies tell them to stop, when their minds tell them they are finished, when any reasonable creature would quit and accept defeat." She leaned closer to him, and her eyes were not the eyes of a prey animal. "Your people feel fear and freeze," she said quietly. "My people feel fear and get creative. We have spent our entire existence as a species afraid of something, and we have learned to use that fear as fuel instead of letting it control us." The war began to turn after that conversation, not because of human numbers or human technology, but because of human will. The swarm had evolved to prey on species that followed logical patterns, that retreated when threatened, that prioritized survival above all else. And they had no defense against creatures who would rather die than quit. Human operators became ghosts that haunted swarm territory, appearing without warning to kill commanders and destroy supply lines before vanishing into terrain that should not have supported life. The swarm began making mistakes, deploying forces to hunt enemies who were already gone, fortifying positions that humans simply walked around, wasting resources on defenses against an enemy that refused to attack where it was expected for the first time in centuries. The hollow swarm learned what it felt like to be prey. General Rex Thiel found himself watching the human operators with something that might have been respect, because they had done what his millions of soldiers could not. They had made the enemy afraid. And when he asked Colonel Okonkwo what would happen when the war was over, when the swarm was defeated and the galaxy no longer needed human hunters, she just smiled that predator's smile and said something that he would remember for the rest of his life. "General, humans have been fighting something our entire existence. When we run out of external enemies, we fight each other, and when we stop fighting each other, we fight ourselves. We are creatures who are only truly alive when we are struggling against something." She looked out at the stars with an expression he could not read. "The galaxy is very large," she said, "and there will always be something that needs hunting." The Galactic Concord sent its finest military scientists to Earth with a simple mission: observe human special forces training and bring that knowledge back to their own species. They expected to find advanced genetic modification facilities where ordinary soldiers were transformed into super warriors through sophisticated biological engineering. They expected to see neural enhancement technology that rewired the brain for combat, efficiency, and fearlessness. They expected secrets they could steal and replicate, and use to create their own elite forces without depending on the flucy, strange and terrifying creatures called humans What they found instead was mud fracture of dawn. Was a HFY researcher who had spent 3 centuries studying military excellence across 100 different species, and she thought she had seen everything there was to see about how warriors were made. She was wrong. The human training facility had no official name on any map, just a set of coordinates in a remote coastal region where the weather was always terrible and the terrain seemed designed by something that hated living things. She stood behind reinforced glass and watched the first day of what humans called selection, and within hours she was sending confused reports back to her superiors. The candidates are carrying heavy logs through freezing ocean water, she transmitted. They have been doing this for 6 hours with no rest and no food, and the instructors are screaming at them constantly. I do not understand the purpose of this exercise. Her Kermoth colleague, a veteran tactical analyst named Rexstar, was equally baffled. There is no skill being taught here, he observed. They are simply suffering. This appears to be torture disguised as training. The human liaison officer, a scarred woman named Sergeant Major Chun, heard their confusion and smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. You are correct that we are not teaching skills. Right now, she said, we are finding out who quits. The aliens watched the training continue through the night with no break for sleep. And they watched candidates begin to fail, not from injury or inability, but from choice. A brass bell hung in the center of the compound, and any candidate who rang it 3 times would be immediately released from training with no punishment and no shame. Just a ride home and a return to normal military service by dawn of the 2nd day. 30% of the candidates had rung that bell, and the aliens could not understand why these are already elite soldiers, Fracture of Dawn said. Studying the records of the candidates who had quit, they passed extremely difficult preliminary tests. Why would they surrender now, when they have already proven their capabilities? Sergeant Major Chun led them to an observation point, overlooking a beach, where the remaining candidates were now running with boats held over their heads in the pre-dawn darkness. Do you see the candidate in the front? She asked, pointing to a small woman who was clearly struggling more than the larger soldiers around her. She has failed 3 physical tests already. Her times are the worst in her class, and she has been injured twice. Then she should be eliminated, Rexstar said. Your selection process appears to be flawed. Watch her, Chun said. They watched, and what they saw changed everything. Fracture of Dawn thought she understood. About human warriors, the small woman stumbled and fell, and her boatmates had to slow down to keep their formation. And the instructors descended on her with screaming fury that would have broken most species. Well, to continue, but she got up and kept moving. And when she stumbled again, she got up again. And when her arm shook so badly she could barely hold her share of the boat, she got up again. She has failed multiple tests, Chun explained. But she has never once considered quitting. She has never even looked at the bell. And that matters more than any test score. Why? Fracture of Dawn asked, genuinely confused. Because we can teach skills, Chun said. We can build strength and speed and technique. What we cannot teach is the willingness to keep going when your body is screaming at you to stop. When your mind is begging you to quit. When every logical part of you says that ringing that bell is the smart thing to do. She pointed to another candidate, a massive male who was clearly the strongest and fastest in the group. He will ring the bell before the week is over, she predicted. He has never failed at anything in his life. And when he finally hits something he cannot muscle through, he will not know how to handle it. The prediction came true on day 4, when the massive candidate faced a challenge that could not be solved with strength alone. And he walked to the bell with an expression of complete confusion, as if he could not understand why his body had betrayed him. The small woman who kept failing tests was still there, Still moving, still refusing to quit. What are you selecting for? Fracture of Dawn finally asked a grizzled instructor who looked like he had been through wars that would have destroyed entire civilizations. The man thought about the question for a long moment before answering. The ones who will not quit on the people beside them, he said simply. Everything else can be fixed. Weak bodies can be made strong. Slow minds can be made sharp. Bad technique can be corrected. But if someone does not have that thing inside them that says, I will not let my teammates down no matter what, then nothing we teach them matters. He looked at the candidates still struggling through the training with something that might have been pride. We are not building warriors here, he said. We are finding the ones who were already warriors inside and just did not know it yet. Fracture of Dawn spent 3 more weeks observing the training, watching candidates face challenges that seemed designed to break them in every possible way. Physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. She watched them stay awake for days at a time. While making critical decisions, she watched them practice skills until their hands bled and then practice more. She watched them face simulated situations where there was no good answer, only bad answers and worse answers. And she watched them choose anyway, and through it all she watched the instructor's warriors who had survived this same crucible and returned to guide others through it, and she saw something she had never seen in any other species. Military training. She saw love. The instructors pushed the candidates beyond any reasonable limit, screamed at them until they cried, created suffering that bordered on cruelty. And they did all of it because they genuinely cared about the people those candidates would someday be protecting. This cannot be replicated, she told her colleagues. On the final day of observation. What do you mean? Rexstar demanded. We have documented every aspect of the training, the exercises, the schedules, the psychological techniques. Surely other species can implement similar programs. Fracture of Dawn had spent decades trying to translate concepts between species. And she knew that some things simply did not translate. Humans have a concept called voluntary suffering for the sake of others, she said. They have another concept called proving yourself through pain. These ideas are so fundamental to their psychology that they do not even think about them. They simply accept that suffering has value if it serves a purpose. She looked at her fellow aliens and saw that they did not understand, could not understand, because their species had never needed to develop such concepts. My people value harmony and balance, she said. The Kormoth value efficiency and hierarchy. Neither of us can truly comprehend a species that believes the path to excellence runs through voluntary agony. A report to the Galactic Concord was 3 words long. Cannot be replicated and somewhere on Earth. A small woman who had failed every physical test and passed every test that actually mattered was receiving a special insignia and becoming something that made the galaxy tremble. She was becoming human special forces, and she had earned it the only way it could be earned, by refusing to quit when quitting was the only logical choice. 1 year into the war, the Galactic Concord had pushed the Hollow Swarm back to their homeworld. It should have been a moment of triumph, but instead it was a moment of despair, because the Swarm homeworld was a nightmare fortress containing billions of warriors who would fight to the last breath. And any traditional assault would cost more lives than the Concord could afford to spend. General Vrexthal stood before the Combined War Council and delivered his assessment in a voice heavy with exhaustion. A siege could last generations, he said. We can blockade the planet and wait for them to starve, but that means maintaining our fleet in hostile space for decades, while the Swarm breeds new armies and looks for weaknesses in our lines. The councilors murmured their agreement, because this was the logical conclusion of a logical war fought by logical species. Then the human representative stood up. And every alien in the room felt silent. Colonel Diana Okonkwo had aged 10 years in the 12 months since she had arrived with her 200 operators. And everyone knew that human years were precious things not to be wasted. Yet she stood straight and spoke clearly. "We have an alternative proposal," she said. "Operation Prometheus, a joint strike force of 2,000 human operators from every special operations branch on Earth, unified under a single command for the first time in our history." She activated a holographic display showing the swarm homeworld in terrifying detail. A planet wrapped in organic architecture and defended by weapons that could destroy fleets. "The mission is simple," she continued. "Insert the strike force through high-altitude orbital drop, penetrate the central hive complex, and eliminate the swarm's leadership caste in a single night." The Diluvian admiral made a sound of disbelief that bubbled through his translation membrane. "You propose to kill the queen?" he asked. "She is protected by millions of warriors in a fortress that has never been breached. This is not a military operation. This is suicide." Okonkwo smiled, and it was the smile of a species that had been practicing suicide missions since before it discovered fire. "We prefer to call it Tuesday," she said. The War Council debated for hours, but in the end, they had no better options. And so Operation Prometheus was approved with the understanding that no one expected the human operators to survive. 2,000 of Earth's finest warriors gathered in orbit above the swarm homeworld, SEALs and SAS, Spetsnaz and JDF-2, KSK and Shaytad, and dozens of other units whose names were classified so deeply that most human governments did not know they existed. They came from nations that had been enemies for centuries, speaking languages that had been used to declare war on each other countless times. Yet when they gathered in the dropship base, they moved like a single organism, because they all spoke the same language when it mattered, the language of those who refused to quit. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb was a Delta operator who had spent 15 years doing things that officially never happened in places that officially did not exist. And as he sealed his drop pod, he felt something he had not felt since his first combat mission. He felt afraid, but he had learned long ago that fear was just another tool, another source of fuel for the fire that kept him moving when his body wanted to stop. So he let the fear flow through him and used it to sharpen his focus. The drop was silent and terrifying. 2,000 individual pods falling through a toxic atmosphere toward a continent-sized hive complex that was already lighting up with defensive fire. Webb's pod was hit twice on the way down, and he felt the impact through his bones. But the armor held, and he crashed into the organic surface of the hive with enough force to crack the structure. Beneath him, he was supposed to link up with his team immediately, but his pod had drifted off course during the descent. And when he emerged into the red-tinged darkness of the swarm tunnels, he was alone. Any reasonable person would have found a defensive position and waited for rescue or death. But Webb was not a reasonable person. He was human special forces. And that meant he had a mission to complete regardless of circumstances. He moved through the tunnels like a ghost, using skills that had been drilled into him until they were more instinct than thought. And when he encountered swarm warriors, he killed them with a brutal efficiency that left no time for fear or doubt. His ammunition ran out after the first hour. So he took weapons from the dead, alien devices he had never trained with, but figured out through desperate experimentation when those ran out too. He improvised explosives from the organic compounds that made up the hive structure, mixing chemicals that should not have been combined and placing charges that should not have worked but did anyway. And when he encountered a swarm patrol that was too large to fight with weapons, he used the one advantage humans had always possessed, their mind's web. Had spent 3 days learning basic swarm pheromone communication from captured prisoners. And now he used that knowledge to send false signals that made the patrol attack each other while he slipped past in the chaos elsewhere in the hive. Other human teams were executing their parts of the mission with the same impossible determination. A SEAL platoon swam through the swarm's acid blood irrigation system for 6 hours, their bodies dissolving even as they pushed forward because the Queen's chamber could only be reached through those tunnels. A joint SAS and Spetsnaz unit held a critical choke point against thousands of swarm warriors, rotating shooters every 30 seconds to manage weapon heat and ammunition consumption, fighting for 4 hours in a space so small that the dead piled up like walls around them. A team of greenbeards captured a swarm communications node and spent 2 hours learning enough of the alien language to broadcast false orders that sent entire warrior castes marching in the wrong direction. The battle was supposed to last 6 hours. It lasted 11. Ammunition was supposed to last throughout the mission. It ran out in 4. The humans adapted, because adapting was what they did. They used stolen weapons and bladed tools and their bare hands. And when those failed, they used their teeth and their rage and their absolute refusal to die before the mission was complete. Web finally linked up with surviving elements of 3 different teams near the Queen's chamber, and together they pushed through the final defenses with a fury that the swarm had never encountered. The Queen was vast and ancient and terrible, a creature that had ruled her species for millennia and had never known fear. And when she saw the small blood-covered humans approaching her throne, she did something that no swarm queen had ever done before she tried to flee. She did not make it when the Queen died. The hive mind that connected billions of swarm warriors simply shattered, and across the entire planet the enemy stopped fighting, not surrendering, not retreating, just stopping, because the thing that had given them purpose and direction was gone. Of the 2,000 operators who dropped onto the swarm homeworld, 1,743 survived. The Concorde had expected total loss. The humans called the casualty rate acceptable. General Vrexthol was on the first ship to land after the all-clear signal, and what he saw in those tunnels would haunt him for the rest of his long life. He saw human soldiers who had fought for 11 hours without rest, who had run out of ammunition and weapons and hope and kept fighting anyway, who had taken wounds that should have killed them and simply refused to die until the mission was complete. He saw Webb sitting against a tunnel wall, missing an arm and most of his blood, still clutching a makeshift blade that dripped with alien ichor. Mission complete, sir, Webb said in a voice that was barely a whisper. And then he finally allowed himself to pass out. Vrexthol stood in the ruins of the Swarm Queen's chamber and finally understood what made humans different from every other species in the galaxy. It was not strength or speed or intelligence or technology. It was simply the absolute unwillingness to stop, the complete rejection of the concept of defeat, the profound belief that any mission could be accomplished if you were willing to pay the price. Other species fought until it was logical to stop. Humans fought until there was nothing left to fight with. And then they found something else. The war was over, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. 10 years had passed since the fall of the Swarm Queen, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. Humanity was no longer a young species seeking permission to join the stars. Humanity was now something that the elder races spoke about in whispers, something that parents used to frighten children into obedience, something that pirates and warlords checked for before raiding any system. The Galactic Concorde's military doctrine had been completely rewritten, and human advisors were attached to every major fleet and army, teaching alien warriors concepts they had never needed to learn: persistence, adaptation, the willingness to suffer for something greater than themselves. Most alien soldiers who attempted human special forces training washed out within the first week, broken by challenges their minds and bodies simply could not comprehend. But the few who survived returned to their people as legends. These survivors became bridges between species. carrying human warrior philosophy to civilizations that had forgotten what it meant to truly fight on the remote planet of Kethara. A young Karmoth warrior named Threx had just completed the training that only 12 members of his species had ever survived, and he wore the small insignia that marked him as something new, an alien who had been forged in the human crucible and emerged as something more. "You honor us," his human instructor said at the graduation ceremony. "You represent everything we believe about the potential that exists in every thinking being. The potential to become more than biology and circumstance would suggest." Threx clicked his mandibles in the gesture his people used for deep respect. "I thought I knew what war was before I came here," he said. "I was a fool. Your people have shown me that war is not about weapons or tactics or even strength. It is about will." He looked at the other graduates, a Vethkai crystalline form glowing with inner light, a Diluvian whose scales had been scarred by training that should have killed an aquatic being, a handful of other species who had proven that the human spirit was not limited to humans. "We will carry this knowledge back to our people," Threx continued. "And someday, perhaps, the galaxy will have more warriors like yours." The instructor smiled and shook his head. "The galaxy does not need more warriors like us," he said. "The galaxy needs warriors like you, beings who chose to become more than they were born to be, who proved that courage is not a human trait, but a universal one waiting to be awakened." Meanwhile, on a quiet observation deck overlooking Earth's spinning blue form, Ambassador Yellen Vasquez sat with an old friend shimmering through glass, had aged in the Vethkai way, her crystalline form showing new facets and depths that came only with centuries of experience. And she had spent the last decade trying to understand the species that had changed everything. "I have studied your people for 10 of your years," she admitted, "and I still do not understand. You are not stronger than us, not faster than the Karmoth, not more intelligent than the Diluvians. And your technology is borrowed from species far older than yours." She turned to face Vasquez with an expression of genuine confusion. "Yet you terrify the galaxy," she said. "Why?" Vasquez thought about the question for a long time. Because it deserved a real answer, she thought. About her grandfather who had survived horrors that should have destroyed him and instead made him stronger. She thought about her mother who had crossed deserts and oceans. With nothing but determination, she thought about her son, now a Green Beret commander, currently deployed somewhere she could not know, doing things she would never hear about. "Because we have always had to fight," she said finally. "Not just enemies, but ourselves, our world, our own limitations. We never had the luxury of being the dominant species on an easy planet." She looked out at the stars that humanity now called home. Every other species in this galaxy evolved as apex predators or as herd animals protected by their numbers. She continued, "You developed technology because you had time and safety. We developed technology because we were dying and had no other choice." Shimmering through glass, processed this information with the careful thoroughness of her kind. "And your special forces?" she asked. "They are the pinnacle of this philosophy?" Vasquez smiled and shook her head. "No," she said. "They are just the ones who volunteered to go first. Every human carries the same potential inside them. The same stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The same willingness to suffer for the people they love." She met the alien's crystalline gaze with eyes that had seen 10 years of humanity's rise to galactic prominence. "Our special forces are not superhuman," she said. "They are the most human humans we have. The ones who have embraced everything our species learned in those millions of years of struggle and refined it into something pure." "Ah." Communication alert interrupted their conversation, and both of them turned to see a priority message flashing on the ambassador's console. The message was from the Concorde's early warning network. and it contained news that made Vasquez's blood run cold. An unknown alien fleet had been detected at the edge of explored space. Massive, aggressive, and completely unlike anything in the Concorde's records. First contact had already occurred, and it had gone badly. The patrol ships that discovered the fleet had been destroyed without any attempt at communication. The Galactic Concorde convened an emergency session within hours, and Vasquez took her place among the representatives of 100 different species who were all looking at the tactical display with the same expression of fear. The unknown fleet was larger than anything the Concorde could quickly assemble, and preliminary analysis suggested technology that exceeded even the elder race's capabilities. This is an existential threat, the Diluvian representative announced. We must mobilize every available resource and prepare for a war that could last centuries. Panic rippled through the chamber as species that had enjoyed peace for millennia confronted the possibility of annihilation. Then Vasquez stood, and the chamber fell silent. Because over the past decade, every species in the Concorde had learned to pay attention when humans spoke about war. We will need 6 months to train up additional cadre for extended operations, she said calmly. In the meantime, Operational Detachment Omega is already en route to the contact zone. How many operators? A delegate asked. 12. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of life support systems keeping 100 different species alive. 12. Humans against an unknown armada that had already destroyed Concorde warships without effort. Then someone laughed. General Vrexthal, now ancient by Kormos standards, but still serving because humans had taught him that retirement was just another word for giving up. 12 of them. He rumbled with something that might have been joy. That poor fleet has no idea what is coming. Other voices joined in. Representatives of species that had fought alongside human special forces, that had watched small teams accomplish what entire armies could not, that had learned through bitter experience never to underestimate the small, fragile, short-lived creatures from Earth. The fear in the chamber transformed into something else. Not confidence exactly, but a kind of faith that had not existed in the galaxy before humans arrived shimmering through glass. Leaned close to Vasquez and spoke quietly. Do you truly believe 12 of your operators can make a difference against such a threat? She asked. Vasquez thought about Marcus Webb, who had completed Operation Prometheus with one arm and no blood left in his body, who now trained the next generation of operators with a prosthetic limb and the same unbreakable will. She thought about all the humans who had done impossible things simply because someone had to do them, and they were the ones who showed up. I believe that those 12 operators will find a way to gather intelligence, disrupt enemy operations, and buy us the time we need, she said. And if they cannot do that, they will die trying. And their deaths will teach us what we need to know to win. She smiled. And it was the smile of a species that had been defying death since it crawled out of the primordial mud. That is what special forces do, she said. They go first, they find a way, and they never ever quit. The galaxy no longer trembled at humanity's special forces. The galaxy relied on them, and somewhere at the edge of known space, 12 humans in black armor were already planning how to accomplish the impossible, because that was simply what they did. The unknown enemy had no idea what was coming, but they would learn. They would all learn.